It's summer 1971 in Millwood, and a wedding is 2 days away. Flowers on the counter, invitation stacked, a dress hanging untouched. By noon, and Harrison is gone. Her car sits where she left it. Her door stands slightly open. The phone rings with no answer. Police sweep the apartment, neighbors, woods, lake, barns. Nothing moves, nothing breaks, nothing points anywhere. Then the questions tighten. Who saw her last? What did she say? Why were her plans left mid-step? In a town built on routine, one missing morning turns every familiar detail into evidence. The day in Harrison vanished began like any other. It was the summer of 1971, a time when small towns still clung to their old ways, and secrets were whispered only in the safety of dimly lit living rooms. And a young woman in her 20s was days away from marrying the man she loved, a fact that should have filled her life with joy and anticipation. Instead, the day she disappeared cast a long shadow over the town of Millwood, one that would never lift, even after all these years. It was a crisp morning when and disappeared. The sun was rising slowly over the hills, casting a soft golden hue over the town's modest homes, their white fences and neatly trimmed lawns all reflecting the calm before the storm, and had woken early that day, the weight of the upcoming wedding hanging over her. There was so much to do: final fittings for the wedding dress, last-minute arrangements for the reception, and of course, the meeting with her sister Ruth, who had promised to help with the final touches. Ruth was to be her maid of honor, a role that came with its own set of expectations. Ones Ruth had been more than happy to fulfill. But by the time the clock struck noon and was gone, no one knew exactly when or how she disappeared. But by the time the first person realized she was missing, a small wave of panic had already started to ripple through Millwood. Her fiancé, John Carter, was the first to notice her absence. He had arrived at her apartment just like he did every day to see her before the big event. But that day, the door was ajar and it wasn't inside. The soft rustling of paper on the table seemed almost mocking in the silence of the room. The flowers for the wedding were on the counter, still waiting to be arranged. The dress, untouched, hung in the closet. Her shoes, positioned neatly by the door, were waiting for her to step into them. But it was nowhere to be found. The reality of it slowly sank into John's chest, his heart sinking into a pit of dread. The first instinct was to call her. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. The second instinct was to call Ruth, and that's exactly what he did. Ruth had always been a comforting presence in Ann's life, the steady hand when things got overwhelming. But when he called her, there was no answer either. The uneasy feeling in John's stomach only grew stronger. It was unlike and to disappear without a word, especially with so much on the line. The wedding was in 2 days. She wouldn't have just left, would she? John immediately went to police, and by that evening, the town was in a state of near frenzy. The search began almost immediately, the air thick with questions that had no answers. Where had Ann gone? Why hadn't anyone heard from her? There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had taken place. Ann's car was still parked outside her apartment. Her belongings, left in a hasty, disorganized manner, didn't suggest any kind of planned departure. There was no letter, no message, nothing to explain why she had disappeared or where she had gone. Her friends and family were all baffled. No one knew anything. And yet, the sense that something wasn't right began to settle over the town like a dark cloud. Ruth arrived at the scene, her face pale with worry. She had known something was wrong the moment John called. The last time she had seen her sister had been the night before, at a small dinner they'd shared at their mother's house. They had discussed the wedding, the plans for the future, and as usual, Ruth had tried to calm Ann's nerves. Wedding planning had always made Ann anxious, and though Ruth was more than happy to step in and help with whatever was needed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and had seemed distant, her eyes heavy with an unspoken burden. But Ruth hadn't pressed her. She had assumed it was just pre-wedding jitters. Now, standing in the middle of Ann's apartment, Ruth could barely hold herself together. The apartment felt empty, hollow, despite the wedding dress hanging there in plain sight. It was as if Ann had simply vanished into thin air. Ruth's breath quickened and she tried to keep her composure. But deep down, a gnawing sensation crept up inside her. She didn't know why. But she felt a deep sense of unease, a feeling that perhaps the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. What if it hadn't just run away? What if something had happened to her? The police were already combing through the town, questioning neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen anything unusual. They scoured the surrounding woods, the lake by the edge of town, even the old barn on the outskirts. But there was nothing, no footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if it had simply vanished. And the worst part? Ruth knew something, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. The last time she had seen Anne, they'd fought. It wasn't a major argument, but it was enough to leave a bitter taste in Ruth's mouth. She had been frustrated with Anne's indecisiveness about the wedding, her constant second-guessing about John. Ruth, who had always been the more level-headed of the two, couldn't understand why and couldn't just relax and enjoy the moment. But there was more to it than that. There were feelings Ruth had been hiding for a long time, feelings that she hadn't been able to confront, even with herself. She was jealous of Anne's life, of her relationship with John, of the love they shared. Ruth had never been in a serious relationship herself, and part of her resented Anne for being the one who always seemed to have it all together. When she saw how happy Anne was with John, it stirred something deep inside her, something dark and uncomfortable. But Ruth couldn't tell anyone that. Not yet, anyway. The town was already in an uproar, the gossip machine spinning stories that no one could confirm. Theories began to circulate. Some said Anne had run off with another man, perhaps someone from her past. Others suggested that she had been abducted, that something sinister was at play. The more time passed, the more the mystery deepened. But nothing, absolutely nothing, pointed to the truth. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Anne grew colder. The town's initial frantic energy began to wane, replaced by a heavy sense of resignation. Some held on to the hope that Anne would return, that she had just needed to get away, to escape the pressures of the wedding and her life. But others, particularly Ruth, began to feel a gnawing sense of dread that something far worse had happened to her sister. Was she dead? Had someone taken her? Or had Anne, in some desperate attempt to escape her life, walked away forever? Ruth's grief began to twist on itself, her emotions becoming a tangled mess of guilt, sadness, and confusion. The feeling of loss, of not knowing, consumed her. Every day, she found herself retracing her steps, replaying every conversation, every moment she had spent with Anne. Was there something she had missed? Some small clue she hadn't recognized? The pain of not knowing was almost worse than thought of losing her forever. And yet, Ruth held on to a terrible, secret hope that maybe Anne would come back. Maybe everything could go back to the way it was before. But as the days passed, the truth seemed farther and farther out of reach. The only thing left was the ever-present question. What had happened to Anne Harrison? Where had she gone and why? Ruth didn't have the answers, and neither did anyone else. The only thing they could do was wait, and hope that one day the mystery would be solved. Ruth Harrison, standing in the midst of her sister's vanished life, was the picture of grief. Yet there was something more to it, something far more unsettling than the simple ache of loss. She didn't just miss Anne. She feared something she couldn't quite articulate. There was a weight, a sense of burden that lay heavy on her shoulders, and it was as though her very existence had become entwined with her sister's disappearance. But unlike John, Anne's fiancé, Ruth was quiet. Her grief measured and internalized, almost as though it was something too dark, too shameful to be shared. She had been there. She had seen the signs, but she hadn't said anything. Not then, and certainly not now. Ruth had always been the older sister, the one who had watched over and often with protective eye. But there was something about that relationship, something about the way Anne's life seemed to unfold so effortlessly, that twisted inside Ruth. Anne had always been the beautiful one, the one with the golden future, the one who was always the center of attention. Ruth had always felt like the shadow, standing in the periphery, watching as Anne's life bloomed in ways Ruth could never quite match. Ruth was the smart one, the practical one, but she was never the radiant one, not in the way Anne was. It had never been a conscious jealousy, not at first. But over the years, as they grew older and their lives began to diverge, it became more apparent to Ruth. Anne's smile, her laughter, her easy way of fitting into the world. Everything about her seemed to draw people to her. John, the man it had fallen in love with, was a prime example of this magnetism. Ruth had always liked John. He was kind, generous, and at first, Ruth believed him to be a safe match for her sister. But as time passed, and as Anne's relationship with John blossomed, Ruth began to sense a strange shift, and had begun to rely more and more on John, seeking his reassurance in ways that Ruth had once been the sole provider of. There was a quiet abandonment in that shift, a sense of loss that Ruth couldn't quite process at the time. She tried to push it away, to ignore the sense of being left behind, but the emotions festered. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Ruth had become more and more agitated, and, usually the calm one in their relationship, seemed to be second-guessing everything. Her nerves were frayed, and Ruth found herself repeatedly reassuring her sister that everything would be fine. "You're making a mistake," Ruth had thought more than once, but she couldn't voice the words. She had too much invested in keeping the peace, in maintaining the facade that everything was perfect, that Anne's life was as it should be. Ruth wanted him to be happy, but there was something about the wedding, the ceremony, the expectations, the people that Anne was surrounding herself with that felt wrong. Something wasn't clicking, and deep down, Ruth felt a subtle sense of dread growing inside her. The night before Anne disappeared, Ruth had stayed up late, preparing final details for the wedding, and had come over to Ruth's apartment, bringing a few things to go over for the event. They sat together at the kitchen table, discussing the upcoming nuptials, the flowers, the seating arrangements, and all the little details that brides often obsess over. Ruth tried her best to be supportive, offering advice when Anne asked for it, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could ignore, and seemed distracted, her thoughts wandering off into places Ruth couldn't reach. Her sister was always so composed, but that night, she seemed fragile, almost broken in some inexplicable way. Ruth couldn't help but notice the way and kept glancing at the door, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Someone who wasn't John. The fleeting glances, the subtle signs of discomfort. Ruth wondered if she was imagining things. But she wasn't. She could feel it. The weight of something unsaid, hanging between them. It was as if Anne was preparing herself for something. Something that Ruth couldn't name. Anne's eyes were filled with uncertainty. A deep, gnawing doubt that Ruth had never seen before they parted for the night, and had hugged Ruth tightly, pressing her cheek against her sister's. "I'm sorry, Ruth," and whispered, "I just don't know if I'm ready." It wasn't the first time Anne had voiced doubts about her upcoming marriage, but there was something in her voice, a deep, almost pained hesitation, that made Ruth's heart ache. "It'll be fine," Ruth said, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that had begun to rise within her. "Everything will work out. You're making the right choice." But as she said those words, Ruth knew they weren't true, and Ruth wasn't sure either. There was a deep, gnawing feeling that maybe the whole thing was a mistake that no one could undo. The next morning, Ruth had woken up to the news. It didn't hit her immediately, not in the way it should have. The reality of Anne's disappearance seeped in slowly, like the shadows of a nightmare that stretched out too long. Ruth couldn't process it at first. It was as though someone had pulled the rug out from under her, and she was left grasping at air, and was missing, gone without a trace. Her first instinct was to call Anne's phone, but when it went straight to voicemail, a wave of cold panic surged through her. The world, the life she had known, had suddenly become unrecognizable. John had already contacted the police, and soon enough, the search began in earnest. The town buzzed with activity, as people from all corners of Millwood came together to help look for Anne. But as the hours turned into days, the search grew more frantic, and still there was no sign of Anne. Ruth found herself caught in a fog of emotions, desperation, guilt, fear, and none of them made sense. Why hadn't it come to her? Why hadn't she said something, anything, to make sense of what was happening? Ruth kept replaying that final conversation in her mind, trying to find something she had missed. But nothing made sense. Nothing could explain Anne's sudden disappearance. The police questioned everyone, including Ruth. The tension in the room was palpable as Ruth recounted her last moments with her sister. The whole situation felt wrong to her, like something was out of place, and had been acting strange, yes, but Ruth couldn't bring herself to say it. She couldn't voice the dark thoughts that were beginning to take root in her mind. The reality was, she knew and better than anyone, and she knew something was terribly off. Something had changed. There was no way and would have left her life behind, not without a word. Ruth was certain of that, but still, no one else seemed to see it. The search for her continued, but Ruth's heart grew heavier with each passing day. The quiet whispers that circulated about Ann's possible disappearance. Was she in trouble? Had she run away? Only made Ruth feel more isolated. In those first few weeks, Ruth's grief became a hollow ache. It wasn't just the loss of her sister. It was a guilt, the overwhelming sense of something unsaid, something unfinished between them. Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed and in some way, that she had missed something crucial, some small crack in Ann's veneer that had gone unnoticed. And as the days turned into weeks, that feeling deepened. Ruth wanted to be strong for everyone around her, but the truth was, she was falling apart on the inside. She was drowning in unanswered questions, in a web of guilt and regret that had no clear escape. But as the days wore on, Ruth began to realize something even more troubling, something that gnawed at her every waking moment, and had trusted her. And yet, Ruth had failed to see what was hidden beneath the surface, and had confided in her, yes, but had Ruth really listened? Had she truly understood the depth of her sister's feelings? The answer was no. Ruth had always assumed Ann's life was picture perfect, but the truth, she now realized, was far more complicated. Ruth's internal conflict began to manifest in strange ways. The guilt, the fear, and the deep, unspeakable knowledge of her role in her sister's life. The things that had gone unsaid, the things Ruth had buried deep within herself, became the haunting echo that followed her wherever she went. She didn't want to face it. She couldn't face it. Not yet. But in the silence that filled her world, Ruth knew she had a part to play in the tragedy of Ann's disappearance. And somehow, deep inside her, she feared that the truth was something she wasn't yet ready to hear. As the days stretched into weeks, the initial shock of Ann Harrison's disappearance began to settle into something darker, more oppressive. What was once a frantic search for answers became a drawn-out process of fruitless speculation, leaving the community of Millwood gripped in a strange kind of limbo. In the beginning, people had rushed to join the search efforts, volunteers combing through the woods, calling out her name into the endless expanse of forest that surrounded the town. The sound of helicopter blades had sliced through the stillness, a reminder of the frantic hope that somewhere, somehow, Ann was alive and waiting to be found. But weeks passed, and with them, the sense of urgency began to fade. The town, initially brimming with activity, began to fall back into its sleepy rhythm. The police investigation, though still technically ongoing, had slowed to a crawl. The leads, if there had ever been any, had dried up, and the evidence, if it can even be called that, was scarce, almost non-existent. Ann's car, left behind in the parking lot of her apartment, had been towed but yielded no clues. The apartment itself, searched and searched again, revealed nothing. No sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play, just an empty, cold room that spoke volumes in its silence. The weight of the unanswered questions pressed harder each day. Theories and rumors began to swirl through Millwood, but none seemed to explain what had happened. Some whispered that Ann had run away, perhaps tired of the pressures of her life, her upcoming marriage, the expectations of being the perfect bride. Others speculated darker possibilities, that she had been abducted, that someone in the town had known more than they were letting on. Yet, with every theory that came and went, the truth seemed to remain as elusive as the shadows that now seemed to stretch longer over the town. Ruth, in particular, found herself tangled in a maze of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt the loss of her sister deep in her bones, a hollow grief that seemed to echo with every passing day. Yet, on the other hand, there was something darker, more complicated gnawing at her, a sense of guilt that refused to be silenced. She could feel the way the town's mood had shifted. In the beginning, the sympathy had been overwhelming. Everyone wanted to help, wanted to find Ann, but now, as the search began to feel more like a formality, the compassion had started to wane. People spoke less about Ann. They went back to their lives, their routines, their jobs. The police, too, were no longer as visible, their presence shrinking in proportion to the diminishing hope of finding Ann alive. It was the quiet, everyday moments that now tormented Ruth the most. The moments when she was alone, lying awake in her bed, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan the only sound in the room. In those moments, her thoughts became a whirlwind of confusion. There was so much she wished she had said to, and so much she had left unspoken. The conversations that should have happened, the words she should have offered to calm her sister's frayed nerves, to reassure her that everything would be all right. But Ruth hadn't been able to give her sister what she needed. Instead, she had kept her doubts hidden, pushed them away into some dark corner of her mind where she wouldn't have to confront them. Now, in the wake of Anne's disappearance, those doubts felt like a suffocating weight, pulling Ruth deeper into the quicksand of regret. Ruth couldn't stop thinking about the letter that Anne had written to her, a letter that had gone unread until much later, when it was found among Anne's things. Ruth had discovered it in a box, tucked away in the back of a drawer in her sister's bedroom, when she had gone through Anne's belongings in the days after the disappearance. The letter was brief but unmistakably revealing. It wasn't just a note. It was a confession, a cry for help, and had written about her growing unease with her relationship with John, about how she wasn't sure if she was ready for marriage. The words, in their rawness and vulnerability, struck Ruth like a physical blow. She hadn't known. She hadn't realized how much and was struggling. The realization that her sister had been carrying this weight alone, without ever turning to Ruth for help, cut deeper than Ruth had anticipated. In the days following Anne's disappearance, Ruth had tried to reach out to John, to offer comfort, to find some kind of solidarity in their shared grief. But John, though devastated, had been a difficult person to connect with. He had withdrawn, his grief consuming him in a way that Ruth found hard to understand. He became a ghost in the town, a figure who haunted the edges of every conversation but never fully participated. Ruth couldn't help but wonder what was going on in John's mind. Was he hiding something? Had he known more about Anne's doubts than he had let on? Had there been something between him and Ruth that could have driven Anne to take such drastic action? There was a particularly tense meeting at the local diner one morning. When Ruth had found herself seated across from John, the silence between them stretching on for far too long. He had invited her to talk, to discuss the case and try to make sense of everything. But the conversation faltered. Ruth kept her eyes down, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup, not daring to meet his gaze. She had known that John was struggling with guilt, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface. They had spoken about her concerns over the wedding, about how everyone had just assumed it would go smoothly. But the words seemed to fall flat in the air, lacking any real substance. John's eyes were hollow, his face gone from the lack of sleep, but Ruth saw something more in him, something she hadn't quite grasped before. There was a certain unease in the way he spoke, a kind of nervous energy that suggested he was holding something back. Ruth could feel it. It wasn't just the absence of and that weighed on him. It was something else, something darker, a feeling that hung like a storm cloud between them, and she couldn't place it. The longer they sat in silence, the more Ruth began to feel the tremors of a growing suspicion deep in her chest. Had John been involved in some way? Was he hiding something from her? From everyone? The conversations Ruth had with the police officers were no easier. They were polite, even sympathetic, but the questions they asked her, the way they probed her reactions, made her feel as if she were part of the investigation. She had to answer questions about Anne's mental state, about her relationship with John, about anything and everything that could provide some kind of clue to where Anne might have gone or why. The probing felt invasive at times, and Ruth found herself growing defensive, unwilling to reveal things she hadn't even fully come to terms with herself. The tension between wanting to find answers and wanting to protect the fragile memory of her sister was becoming unbearable. As the days passed, Ruth began to feel a deep, gnawing frustration. She wanted to do something, anything, to uncover the truth, but every effort seemed to fall short. The lake, the woods, the small trails that had been searched over and over, none of them held any clue. The sense of helplessness crept in, and with it came a suffocating feeling that the truth was somehow being deliberately hidden from her, from everyone. And then came the rumors, whispered in hushed voices around town. Some said that Ruth knew more than she let on. Some even suggested that she was involved in her sister's disappearance, that perhaps Ruth had been the one to drive her away, to cause her to run. The darker the days grew, the harder it became for Ruth to distinguish between her own thoughts and the thoughts others were planting in her mind. Every quiet moment was now filled with the question, could I have done something differently? Could I have prevented this? Could I have been there for, and in ways I failed to see? The answers, as elusive as they were, hung in the air, just out of reach, like the faintest whisper of something forgotten. Ruth's guilt clung to her, suffocating her every moment. As she walked through the town, through the places that once felt so familiar, everything had changed and was gone, and with her, so much of Ruth's own sense of self. The unspoken words, the unexamined emotions, and the fractured relationships all stood between her and the truth. The truth, where was it? What had really happened to Harrison? As the weeks stretched into months, Ruth found herself caught in a slow, agonizing spiral of grief, guilt, and regret. Each passing day seemed to drag on endlessly, the weight of Anne's disappearance settling like a cold, unshakable fog over her life. The investigation had stalled, and the community, once filled with the urgency of searching for answers, now seemed to have moved on. Life in Millwood had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but for Ruth, nothing was normal anymore. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Her conversations, once filled with the easy rhythm of family life, now felt stilted, as though everyone were treading carefully around her, afraid to say too much. Even John, her brother-in-law, who had once been a constant presence in her life, seemed distant. His grief, though palpable, was something that Ruth could barely relate to. He had his own pain, his own loss to wrestle with, but Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that his grief wasn't as open, as raw as hers. There was something guarded about him, something that made her wonder if he, too, was hiding something important. It was in those quiet, lonely hours that Ruth found herself revisiting the events of the night before and disappeared. She would close her eyes and imagine the conversations they had shared, replaying the last moments they spent together in that half-lit apartment, trying to extract some deeper meaning from those fleeting words and gestures. And had been anxious, that much was clear. But Ruth hadn't known how to reach her. She had assumed that the wedding jitters, the pressure of the upcoming nuptials, were all contributing to Anne's unease. Ruth had been so focused on making sure everything was perfect, on smoothing over cracks that Anne's doubts had exposed, that she hadn't paused to listen to the deeper, unspoken fears that seemed to haunt her sister. There had been the argument, the one Ruth couldn't quite forget, even though she tried to bury it in the recesses of her mind. It wasn't a major fight, nothing that would explain Anne's disappearance, but it had been a disagreement nonetheless, one that had left an uncomfortable silence hanging between them, and had become frustrated with Ruth's suggestions about the wedding, the little details Ruth insisted on perfecting. Ruth, in her determination to help him through the process, had pushed too hard and had seemed irritated, even a little resentful. Ruth had chalked it up to pre-wedding stress, but looking back now, she wondered if there was more to it. What if it had been feeling trapped, feeling as though she had no way out? What if in that moment she had been desperate to escape, to find some space where she could think, where she could breathe? The questions were maddening. Ruth had no answers, only doubts, only shadows where clarity should have been. And as the days passed without any news, without any leads in the case, that uncertainty began to eat away at her. She started to question everything. Was it possible that Anne had simply run away, as some had suggested? Or was there something more sinister at play? Ruth couldn't let go of the feeling that there was something important, that had been overlooked, something that no one was talking about. The police had done their best, but there was no trace of Anne, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence to suggest foul play. The more Ruth thought about it, the more convinced she became that the key to finding Anne wasn't out there somewhere in the woods or by the lake, but buried within the family itself, within the relationships and secrets that no one had dared to confront. Ruth knew, deep down, that she had been a part of this puzzle from the beginning, whether she had wanted to be or not. She had been a witness to the tension between Anne and John, the subtle but undeniable cracks in their relationship, and had been distant in the weeks leading up to the wedding, and Ruth had chalked it up to normal wedding stress. But what if it wasn't? What if Anne had known something about John, something that had made her doubt their future together? Ruth couldn't ignore the possibility that there had been more to Anne's feelings than she had let on, that her sister had been hiding her true emotions, unable to voice them even to those closest to her. The guilt was overwhelming. Ruth knew she had failed, and in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She had been the one to reassure Anne, to tell her that everything would be fine, that the wedding was the right choice. But what if it hadn't been? What if it had been struggling with doubts she hadn't known how to express? Ruth couldn't help but wonder if, by insisting on the wedding's importance, she had inadvertently pushed Anne into a decision she wasn't ready for. The thought gnawed at her. Had she been too focused on what was expected of her as a supportive older sister, the one who always had the answers, and in doing so, had she failed to see the cracks in Anne's heart? The more Ruth reflected on her role in Anne's life, the more she realized how much she had taken for granted. Anne had always seemed so composed, so certain of herself, but Ruth now understood that her sister had been battling her own demons, silently carrying burdens that Ruth had never truly seen. There had been so many unspoken words between them, so many things left unsaid, and now those silences echoed in Ruth's mind, each one a painful reminder of what could have been. Ruth had tried to move on with her life, but the absence of and left a void that she couldn't fill. She had become a shell of the person she once was, consumed by the weight of unanswered questions. She had become obsessed with the investigation, scouring every bit of information she could find, hoping for something, anything, that would lead her to Anne. But every lead, every theory, seemed to evaporate as quickly as it appeared. The police had little to go on, and the rumors swirling around the town only seemed to add to the confusion. Some people thought Anne had run off with another man. Some believed she had been abducted, and others simply assumed that she had left voluntarily. But none of these theories seemed to fit with the person Anne had been. She wasn't the type to just disappear without a word, without telling anyone where she was going. That wasn't her, and had always been one who kept everything in order, who took care of the details, who made sure nothing was left to chance. Her disappearance didn't fit any of the patterns that Ruth could understand. It was during one of her sleepless nights, when the guilt and frustration had reached a breaking point, that Ruth finally broke. She sat in Anne's old bedroom, surrounded by the things her sister had left behind. The books, the photographs, the wedding invitations that were never sent. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. How had it come to this? How had they ended up here, with Anne gone and Ruth left alone with nothing but questions? She closed her eyes, trying to remember her sister's face, trying to hold on to the image of the woman Anne had been before all of this. But the face she saw in her mind was fading, becoming more and more distant, as though even the memory of Anne was slipping away. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. Ruth felt like she was drowning in it, unable to find her way to the surface. She had been through the motions, visited the police station, spoken to friends and family, but nothing seemed to move the needle. Every day, she woke up to the same empty house, the same empty life, and every night she went to bed with the same gnawing ache in her chest. The questions never stopped. What had happened to Anne? Why had she disappeared? Had Ruth missed something? Had she failed to see the truth when it was right in front of her? Ruth's mind was a constant swirl of confusion and self-recrimination, and with each passing day, it became harder to distinguish between the reality of Anne's disappearance and the fear that had taken root deep within her. The truth seemed to slip further out of reach, a phantom that danced just beyond the edge of her consciousness. But Ruth knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of uncertainty and regret. Something had to change. The truth had to come out, and Ruth would do whatever it took to find it, even if it meant confronting her own darkest fears. As Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the soft clink of her spoon against the cup felt like an intrusive sound in the stillness that had overtaken her life. The emptiness around her seemed to magnify the smallest of noises, each sound like a sharp reminder of the silence that had enveloped her since Anne's disappearance. The days had become long and indistinguishable from one another, a steady blur of time passing without resolution. The once bustling town of Millwood had settled back into its quiet rhythm, yet for Ruth, nothing was the same. The world had shifted under her feet, and she was left grasping for something solid to hold on to, something that could explain what had happened to and something that could help her make sense of the void. Ruth's mind was filled with the memories of her sister, the moments they had shared, the conversations that should have been different, the quiet times when it had seemed distant, and the times Ruth had pushed her too hard. Anne had always been the radiant one, the one who could light up a room with a smile, the one who made things seem easy. Ruth, on the other hand, had always been more reserved, more cautious. But that caution, that need to control, had driven her to push in ways that now felt suffocating. What if and had been trying to say something all along? What if she had been reaching out in her own way, signaling that she was afraid, that she wasn't ready, that she didn't want this life that everyone around her assumed she did? The letter she had found after Anne's disappearance weighed on her constantly, an unspoken accusation in her hands. It was a letter that Anne had written to her, though Ruth had not discovered it until weeks later, when the search efforts had all but stopped. It wasn't a letter meant for anyone but Ruth, but it had been left behind, a final message hidden in plain sight, and had written about her fears, her doubts about the wedding, and most poignantly, her feelings of being trapped. The wedding, the life with John, the expectations of those around her, all of it had become too much, and Ruth had missed it. She had missed the subtle hints, the cracks in Anne's facade, and now, as she read those words over and over, the guilt consumed her. The letter painted a portrait of a woman who was struggling, a woman who had no idea how to escape the path laid out before her, and had written about how everyone expected her to be perfect. How, after all, she was the one who had it all together, the one who had always known what she wanted. But that was a lie, wasn't it? And hadn't known. She had been as unsure, as uncertain as anyone else, but she had never let anyone see it. She had kept those feelings locked inside, and Ruth had been too focused on the outward image perfection to see the storm brewing inside her sister. In that moment, Ruth realized how little she had truly known about Anne. They had shared a lifetime of memories, but had they ever really seen each other? Had Ruth ever truly listened to Anne, or had she been too caught up in her own sense of control, in her own insecurities about being the older sister, the responsible one? The letter shattered the illusion that Ruth had it all figured out, that she had been the one who could always fix things, and had been struggling, and Ruth had missed it, and had been asking for help in the only way she knew how, and Ruth had failed to see it. That failure, that sense of being blind to her sister's pain, haunted her in ways that words could not capture. The search for her had ground to a halt, but the investigation into her disappearance had not. The police were still involved, but as the weeks stretched on without new evidence, Ruth began to feel that they, too, were losing interest. They had no leads, no witnesses, no physical evidence that could explain what had happened to Anne. Theories continued to swirl, but no one seemed to know anything for certain. Some suggested that Anne had run away, that she had gotten cold feet and decided to leave her life behind. Others, particularly Ruth, began to consider the darker possibility that Anne had been taken, that someone in town knew more than they were letting on. But the lack of evidence made even the thought of abduction seem like a far-fetched fantasy. Anne hadn't left behind a trail, not even a single footprint. And yet the suspicion that something more sinister was at play continued to gnaw at Ruth's insides. In the midst of the silence that surrounded her, Ruth began to do something that, in hindsight, seemed almost reckless. She began to dig into her sister's past, not just the recent months leading up to her disappearance, but the years before. Ruth had always believed that and had a perfect life, that everything had been smooth and easy for her. She had been the golden girl, the one who got everything right. But the more Ruth looked, the more she began to uncover things that made her question that belief. Anne's relationships, especially with John, hadn't always been as perfect as Ruth had assumed. There had been tension in their relationship, moments when it seemed distant, when Ruth had caught glimpses of something darker beneath the surface. There had been the arguments that Ruth had dismissed at the time, the moments when it seemed unhappy, even though she would never admit it. But the most telling discovery Ruth made was a connection between Anne's disappearance and a part of her sister's life that no one had known about, an old boyfriend, someone from Anne's past who had reappeared just before her wedding. Ruth had never been told about him, and had never mentioned him. But the more Ruth searched, the more she uncovered. The man's name was Derek. He had been someone, and had dated briefly years ago, before she had met John. He had been a charismatic, impulsive man, someone who had swept and off her feet, but their relationship had ended abruptly. Ruth had never known the details, but as she pieced together bits of information from old friends of Anne's, she began to see a clearer picture emerge. Derek had been a complicated figure in Anne's life, someone who left a lasting impact on her, someone who had never truly disappeared from her heart, even if it had tried to bury those feelings. He had come back into her life just before the wedding, and although Anne had never spoken to Ruth about it, Ruth couldn't ignore the fact that this reappearance had coincided with her sister's growing unease, and had been conflicted, torn between the life she had built with John and the unfinished business with Derek. Ruth had no concrete evidence to suggest that Derek had anything to do with Anne's disappearance, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Had Anne been planning to leave John? Had Derek been a catalyst, a spark that had reignited old feelings and doubts in Anne's heart? Ruth couldn't say for sure, but the more she thought about it, the more she began to wonder if this old relationship had been a crucial piece of the puzzle. The guilt Ruth felt about Anne's disappearance deepened with every new revelation. She had been so focused on the surface, so determined to ensure that Anne's life looked perfect from the outside, that she had failed to see the cracks beneath. She had missed the signs, the subtle shifts in Anne's behavior, the way her sister had started to pull away, the way she had begun to question everything. But Ruth hadn't seen it. She hadn't known how to see it. She had been too wrapped up in her own insecurities, in her own sense of responsibility, to realize that Anne was drowning in her own way. Ruth had never considered that her sister might be holding on to a secret, a part of her life that she couldn't share, a part of her that she didn't even understand herself. The deeper Ruth dug, the more she uncovered. She discovered more about Anne's relationship with John and how, despite their outward appearance as a perfect couple, there had been moments of tension, of doubt. She found out more about Derek and how, even after their brief fling, and had never truly let go of him. Ruth's investigation into her sister's life felt almost like an invasion of Anne's privacy. But at the same time, Ruth couldn't stop herself. She needed to know the truth, needed to understand what had happened, needed to piece together the fragments of her sister's life that had been left behind. But in the quiet of her own home, with all the new information swirling in her mind, Ruth felt no closer to the truth. She had more questions now than ever before. The puzzle had grown more complex, more elusive. The closer she got to finding answers, the farther away they seemed. Every lead she followed, every piece of the puzzle she uncovered, seemed to lead to more dead ends. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness, Ruth couldn't stop. She couldn't let go of the idea that the truth was out there, waiting to be found, waiting for her to piece it all together. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ruth began to realize something. The truth, whatever it was, wasn't going to come easily. It would require patience, perseverance, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities of her sister's life. The things that Ruth had been blind to, the things she had avoided. But the truth was out there, waiting, and Ruth would find it, no matter how long it took. As the weeks blurred into months, Ruth's search for answers became an obsession. The quiet moments in the empty house, the slow, painful process of sifting through fragments of Anne's life, all merged into an overwhelming cacophony of questions. Each day, she felt more deeply the absence of her sister, a hole in her chest that only grew larger as she uncovered more. Ruth knew something had happened to Anne, something significant and far-reaching, and yet, despite every effort to dig into the past, the truth remained stubbornly elusive. But something about the silence, the suffocating, aching quiet, told her she was getting closer. Ruth could feel it in her bones. The more she thought about it, the more she began to realize that the missing pieces were not just hidden in the things Anne had left behind. They were buried deep within the people who had surrounded and in the subtle, unspoken dynamics between them. Ruth knew Anne better than anyone else, or so she had always believed. Yet, with each new detail she uncovered, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. She had never really known her sister, not in the way she thought, and she certainly hadn't known everything that Anne had been struggling with. Ruth's investigation took on a new urgency. She felt an almost desperate need to unravel the mysteries that had once seemed so trivial or insignificant. Her mind was consumed by the idea that Anne's life had been a complex web, and Ruth had only seen the surface. In her search for answers, Ruth began to look into the people who had been closest to Anne, her friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances. She combed through in social media, reread old messages, and even visited places and had frequented, hoping to catch some hint of the life her sister had lived outside of the narrow view Ruth had held of her. In one of her visits to Anne's favorite coffee shop, Ruth met an old friend of Anne's from college. Samantha had been someone Anne had confided in during their school days, and Ruth had never really known the depth of their friendship. Over coffee, as they spoke, Samantha revealed something Ruth had never considered, and had been unsettled in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, but not just because of the wedding, and had felt a growing distance from everyone around her, including Ruth. She had started to pull away, to withdraw into herself. Samantha described Anne as someone who was always so vibrant, so full of life, but in the months before she disappeared, there had been a certain sadness in her eyes, a quiet melancholy that no one had been able to address. Ruth had always prided herself on being the one, and turned to in times of need, the one who had all the answers. But in that moment, Ruth realized how much she had missed, and had been struggling long before the wedding. It wasn't just about John. It wasn't just about the pressure of the wedding day, and had been an emotional turmoil, quietly slipping into a place where no one could reach her. As Samantha spoke, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed to notice that she had been so wrapped up in her own life, in her own need to control the world around her, that she had missed Anne's silent plea for help. Ruth's guilt, once a quiet undercurrent, now became a constant companion, haunting her every step. She had spent so many years trying to be the perfect sister, the perfect person, but it was all an illusion, and hadn't needed perfection. She had needed understanding. She had needed Ruth to see her, to listen to her, and Ruth had been too absorbed in her own insecurities to notice. The more Ruth thought about it, the more she came to believe that Anne's disappearance was not just an act of escape. It wasn't as simple as in running away or choosing to start a new life. Something had happened. Something had pushed Anne to the brink. Ruth began to entertain the possibility that someone else was involved, someone who played a role in Anne's decision to leave, or worse, to disappear entirely. There were so many unanswered questions, and so many pieces that didn't fit together. But Ruth couldn't dismiss the nagging feeling that the answers were right in front of her. As she dug deeper into Anne's past, Ruth uncovered a disturbing pattern. There were mentions of Derek, the man from Anne's past, scattered in old conversations, in fragments of letters, and even in some of Anne's private journals. Derek had been a person and had never truly forgotten, a figure from her youth who had somehow managed to stay in her life, even if only in the shadows. Ruth had never known the full story of Anne and Derek's relationship. She had known that it had ended years ago, but she had never known the depth of Anne's feelings for him, the way that their connection had lingered even after they had parted ways. As Ruth read through old letters and messages between Anne and Derek, she began to realize that their relationship had been far more complicated than she had imagined. It wasn't just a fling or a passing affair. Derek had been a significant part of Anne's life, and although Anne had moved on to John, there had always been an emotional thread connecting her to Derek. Ruth had assumed that Anne's relationship with John was everything, that it was a culmination of everything Anne had ever wanted. But the more Ruth uncovered, the more she started to wonder if Anne had been lying to herself about her feelings for John. She had never questioned it before, but now it seemed all too clear that there had been something unresolved with Derek, something that had kept her emotionally tethered to him. The realization struck Ruth like a bolt of lightning. Had Derek been part of the reason and had disappeared? Had he reappeared in her life at a time when Anne was already uncertain, already filled with doubts about her future? Ruth couldn't shake the image of Derek, his charm, his charisma, the way he had always had a way of getting under Anne's skin. He was the kind of man who had a magnetic pull, the kind of man who made people feel like they were the center of a universe. But now Ruth wondered if that very magnetism had been a double-edged sword. Had Derek used his charm to manipulate Anne, to pull her back into his orbit just as she was about to commit to John? The more Ruth pieced together the timeline of events, the more she began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Anne had been on the verge of a huge life change, and Derek's reappearance had complicated things. But was he the reason Anne had disappeared? Was he the one who had caused her to vanish without a trace? Or had there been someone else involved? Ruth couldn't let go of the idea that Derek had been a key player in this mystery. He had been absent for years, but his sudden reappearance just before Anne's wedding seemed too coincidental to ignore. Ruth began to reach out to people who had known Derek, trying to find out more about his past, his motivations, his relationship with Anne. But no one seemed to know much about him. Derek had a way of slipping in and out of people's lives without leaving any lasting impression. He had always been a bit of a ghost, someone who appeared when he was needed and vanished when he was done. But Ruth wasn't done. She couldn't afford to be. The more she pushed, the more she uncovered disturbing pieces of the puzzle. It wasn't just that and had been emotionally torn between John and Derek. It was the way Derek had treated her. Ruth uncovered reports from friends who had seen Derek's manipulative side, his ability to twist the truth and create drama where there had been none, and had always been the type of person who wanted to make everyone happy, who had always tried to avoid conflict. But Derek had a way of drawing her into his web, of making her feel responsible for his feelings, for his actions. Ruth began to understand that, and had never been in control of that relationship, that Derek had always been the one pulling the strings, even after they had broken up. The realization hit Ruth hard. She had always thought of him as someone who had it all together, someone who had never been vulnerable, never been manipulated. But the more Ruth uncovered, the more she realized how wrong she had been, and had been emotionally vulnerable, had been caught in a cycle of doubt and manipulation that had left her spiraling. Ruth had been blind to it, unable to see the depth of Anne's struggles, unable to see the true toll that Derek had taken on her. And now, as Ruth uncovered more of the truth, she felt the weight of her own complicity in Anne's pain. The journey to uncover the truth had become a bitter, painful process, but it was also the only way forward. Ruth knew that she had to continue, that she couldn't stop until she knew the full story. Anne's disappearance had shattered her, had forced her to confront everything she had taken for granted, everything she had overlooked. But now, in the silence of her investigation, Ruth realized that the only way to heal was to face the truth head-on. No matter how difficult it was, no matter how much it hurt, she had uncovered the full picture of Anne's life, of the people who had shaped her, and of the forces that had driven her to disappear. Only then could Ruth hope to find peace, or at least the beginning of it. As Ruth's search for the truth continued, the weight of the unknown began to pull her deeper into a well of uncertainty. Each new revelation about Anne's life before her disappearance seemed to uncover more layers of complexity, more unresolved questions that refused to be answered. The image Ruth had once held of her sister, the perfect, confident woman on the verge of marriage, was now shattered into 1,000 fragile pieces. Every piece she found seemed to contradict the others, creating a puzzle that grew more perplexing with each passing day. Ruth began to question not just Anne's life, but her own understanding of everything she had known about her sister. It wasn't just Derek or the unresolved emotions between Anne and him that haunted Ruth. There were moments, glimpses into Anne's inner world, that Ruth had overlooked in the past. She thought back to the way Anne had spoken about her upcoming wedding, how she had seemed excited, but there had always been something underneath that excitement, something that Ruth had dismissed as nerves or pre-wedding jitters, and had always been the one to keep her feelings tightly contained, to maintain control, and Ruth had never thought to dig deeper. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, Ruth saw that Anne had been suffocating beneath the surface. She had been struggling in ways that Ruth had been too busy, too focused on her own life, to notice. The more Ruth uncovered about Anne's state of mind, the more she began to feel the sting of guilt. She had always assumed she was there for her sister, that she had been the one to offer support, to guide, and through life's complexities. But in reality, Ruth had been too wrapped up in her own sense of responsibility, too absorbed in her role as the perfect older sister, to recognize the cracks in Anne's emotional armor. Ruth had been blind to the fact that, and had been carrying a weight that she hadn't known how to share. There were so many things Ruth wished she had done differently, moments she could have stepped in, conversations she could have had, ways she could have been there for her, and in a way that went beyond surface-level support. But those moments were gone, and the more Ruth thought about them, the heavier the burden became. She had failed her sister, and that knowledge was eating away at her. But it wasn't just guilt that weighed on Ruth. It was also a growing sense of anger. Anger at herself, at Derek, at the situation that had led to this point, and had been in love with someone else, someone who had never truly let go of her. Derek had come back into her life at a vulnerable time, and Ruth couldn't help but feel that his presence had been a catalyst for Anne's unraveling. He had been the one who had made and questioned everything. Her relationship with John, her future, her very sense of self. Derek had a way of weaving his influence into people's lives, making him feel like they were the center of his world. And, despite her best efforts to move on, had been pulled back into that orbit. It had happened slowly, imperceptibly, and by the time Ruth had started to notice, it was too late. As Ruth continued to probe deeper into Anne's past, she found more and more evidence of Derek's lingering influence. There were emails, phone messages, and notes, small pieces of correspondence that Anne had kept hidden, perhaps subconsciously, or perhaps because she hadn't known how to confront the feelings they stirred up. Ruth came across a text message from and to one of her close friends just weeks before she vanished. It was a message that left no room for misinterpretation, and had been considering what it would mean to leave John. The wedding had been weighing heavily on her, and her feelings for Derek had resurfaced and had been torn, caught between the life she had built with John and the part of her that still ached for someone else. The message was brief, almost cryptic, but it left Ruth reeling, and hadn't been just uncertain about her wedding. She had been on the verge of making a life-altering decision, and Ruth hadn't known. She hadn't even suspected. The text was like a knife in Ruth's chest. It confirmed what she had long feared, that and had been struggling in ways Ruth couldn't begin to understand. But it also made Ruth feel small, as though her own perception of their relationship had been a mere illusion, and had confided in her friends, in people who weren't as close to her, and yet Ruth had been left out of the loop. It felt like betrayal, but Ruth knew it wasn't intentional, and hadn't meant to push Ruth away. She had simply been carrying too much, and Ruth hadn't been able to see it. In the days that followed, Ruth's investigation took an even darker turn. She began to focus on the time leading up to Anne's disappearance, trying to piece together every detail, every moment, to understand what had finally driven Anne to leave. It was then that Ruth found something that made her stomach turn. A photograph, taken just days before and vanished. It was a picture of Anne and Derek, standing together in a park, their arms around each other. The image was innocent enough at first glance, but something about it felt wrong. There was an intimacy between them that went beyond friendship, beyond anything that should have been happening between a woman about to marry another man, and had always kept her personal life close to the vest. But in that photograph, she was open in a way Ruth had never seen her before. It was as if Anne had let go of the walls she had built around herself, if only for a moment. The photograph sent a chill through Ruth. She hadn't known about it. She hadn't known that and had been seeing Derek, spending time with him in secret, reconnecting in ways that were far more than just casual. The image was evidence that something had been going on beneath the surface, something that Ruth hadn't been aware of. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle that made the situation seem more complicated than Ruth had imagined. Ruth could no longer deny it. Anne's disappearance was not just a result of wedding stress or doubts about her relationship with John. It was something deeper, something darker, and had been in love with Derek. And he had been the one to pull her back into a world she thought she had left behind. Derek had been a manipulator, someone who would use his charm to win, and over time and time again. And now, Ruth had to confront the ugly truth, and hadn't been as free as she had led everyone to believe. She had been held captive by a man who had never truly let her go. But Ruth couldn't stop there. She needed to know the whole story. The more she learned about Derek, the more she realized that he was a man who had a history of leaving people in his wake, broken and unsure themselves. Derek was the kind of person who thrived on control, who needed to feel that he was the center of the world, and it had been one of his most vulnerable targets. Ruth didn't want to believe that and had been so deeply affected by Derek, but the evidence was undeniable. The way he had re-entered Anne's life when she was already on the edge, the way he had manipulated her feelings, had ultimately pushed her to a place where she felt she had no way out. The anger Ruth felt toward Derek was palpable, but she also felt something else, a deep, aching sadness, and had been caught in a trap Ruth had never seen. She had been manipulated into thinking she had to choose between two worlds, and in the end, the weight of that decision had been too much for her to bear. Ruth could only imagine how desperate Anne must have felt, torn between her loyalty to John and her unresolved feeling for Derek. It was a place of emotional chaos, a place that Ruth couldn't fully understand, but she could feel the depth of it now, and had been drowning, and no one had been able to pull her out. Ruth began to wonder if there had been more to Anne's disappearance than just a choice between two men. What if Anne had felt like she was running from something even darker, something more personal than just a love triangle. What if Derek had been part of a bigger, more dangerous picture, one that Ruth had yet to see? The more Ruth tried to put the pieces together, the more the truth seemed to slip through her fingers. The closer she came to understanding Ann's pain, the more questions emerged, questions that pointed to a much larger, more sinister force at play. Had Ann been running from Derek, or had she been running from something else entirely? The haunting thought lingered in Ruth's mind, and she couldn't shake it. The truth was out there, but it was hidden in layers of secrets that no one seemed ready to reveal. And Ruth was left with nothing but the fragments of her sister's life, each piece more confusing than the last. Ruth sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the photographs and letters scattered on the table before pressing down on her like an invisible force. Each page, each image, felt like an accusation, evidence of the things she had missed, the things she should have seen. The clues, however, were now adding up, forming a story she wasn't prepared to hear, let alone accept. Ann's life, one so straightforward in Ruth's mind, was far more complex, far more tangled than she could have ever imagined. As Ruth sifted the remnants of her sister's life, she felt as though she were piecing together the shattered fragments of a mirror, each shard reflecting a different version of Ann, a version that Ruth had never truly understood. In those quiet moments, Ruth's thoughts kept circling back to one thing: the letter, the one Ann had written, the one that Ruth had found hidden in the back of a drawer long after her sister had disappeared. It had been a cry for help, an expression of everything Ann had been too afraid to say aloud. The letter had been raw, unfiltered, a glimpse into a mind that had been struggling, suffocating, beneath the weight of expectations. Expectations Ruth had imposed without realizing. Ruth had thought she was helping her sister by encouraging the wedding, by pushing for everything to be perfect, but in truth, she had been suffocating Ann, and had needed to make her own choices, to live her own life, and Ruth had never given her that space. The more Ruth thought about the letter, the more she realized how much Ann had been hiding. The emotional distance that had been building between them for months now felt like a gap, an unbridgeable divide. Ruth had assumed that it was just wedding nerves, that her sister was simply overwhelmed by the impending event. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, Ruth could see that Ann had been battling something much deeper. The wedding had been a symbol of everything and was expected to be perfect, beautiful, the picture of happiness. But it had never felt that way to Ann. In her letter, Ann spoke of feeling trapped, of being unable to escape the expectations placed on her. She had been suffocating under the pressure of being the perfect bride, the perfect sister, the perfect daughter. And Ruth had been too busy trying to keep everything together to see it. Ruth's guilt grew heavier with every revelation. She had never fully grasped the depth of her sister's inner world, the turmoil that had been silently eroding her from within, and had been afraid of disappointing people, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of living a life that wasn't truly hers. Ruth had thought she was helping, but she had been pushing Ann further into a corner, into a life that Ann hadn't chosen. The realization was gut-wrenching. Ann hadn't disappeared because of wedding stress or cold feet. No, there was something far more painful at play. Ann had been in the throes of profound internal crisis, a crisis Ruth had failed to see, and now she was left with the consequences of that blindness. But as Ruth sat there, lost in the weight of her thoughts, another realization began to form. Ann's disappearance wasn't just about the wedding, and it wasn't just about Derek. The more Ruth looked into the details, the more it became clear that something far more insidious had been happening. Derek had been a part of it, but he hadn't been the only piece of the puzzle. There was something else, something more hidden beneath the surface, something that Ann had never shared with anyone. And now, Ruth was starting to feel the full gravity of it. The more Ruth dug into Ann's past, the more she began to uncover unsettling details about Ann's relationship with her family, especially with their parents. Ruth had always believed that their family was a unit, solid and unbreakable. But the more she reflected on her relationship with Ann, the more she realized how little they had truly understood each other. Ruth had always been the responsible one, the one who took care of everything, while Ann had always been a carefree one, the one who followed the rules and did what was expected. But what Ruth hadn't understood was that Ann had never really had a voice in their family. She had always been the one to follow, the one to conform. And as Ruth pieced together the fragments of their past, she began to see the cracks in their family dynamic, cracks that had been there all along.